this is an online event, obviously due to the coronavirus crisis. And this is the conference title today, COVID-19 from Lockdown to Recovery. When we were choosing the topic and title of this conference, actually in summer, we were indeed thinking more about the idea of how to reconstruct the economy after the crisis that the first wave has left, with all the ideas on fiscal and monetary policy that people think of these days. But after laughter comes tears, and after the dance comes the hammer, to put it into a business cycle model of the new coronavirus logic. One quite interesting twist today could be the question on how to keep an economy running in the face of a massive second wave that very likely pushes the European economies once again down, a double-dip recession perhaps, and from recovery to lockdown, maybe into an ongoing long-standing crisis which has no clear-cut exit, since we probably want to keep on preventing the spread and thus reducing contacts. It might have the potential to blow up the traditional economy as we know it. So there are many questions we'll focus on today with a number of excellent speakers. As a keynote, Robert Skidelsky will in a few minutes talk about the economic recovery in the age of COVID-19. Later, we have a session on economic response to COVID-19 in the European Union. As you may know, the political response to the crisis was a massive recovery fund at the EU level, which by now did not pass the legislative process. But will this be enough to be prepared also for a potential ongoing crisis after a second wave? There will be a session on how to prevent a lost generation. This seems to be a highly relevant question against the background of massive youth unemployment, what we have seen during the last crisis, the Euro crisis, a few years ago. Later in the afternoon, Daniel Gross and Barry Eichhorn-Green will tell us whether there will be a return to normal. I am really happy to welcome you here and to follow all of these interesting talks. Welcome to all the great speakers at this conference, the colleagues at CEPS and at ZBW, and of course to the audience at Zoom in the live stream. Note that you can use the Q&A function later on, send your questions to us so that the moderators are able to use them. Note that all the discussions are free online at YouTube, and every speaker is invited to contribute an article to our journal Intereconomics, which publishes a special issue as a forum on this conference. So welcome everybody. And as I said, this is a joint conference of Intereconomics and CEPS. So I will hand over to Cynthia Alcides, the Director Interim of CEPS. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Christian, and very welcome to everyone also from my side. It is always a pleasure to have this annual meeting. It is quite unfortunate that we cannot meet in person. The CEPS Intereconomics Conference has always been an opportunity for people also to meet in person and to network. We need to give up on this pleasure, but we will try to do our best to keep the audience involved. As Christian said, we invite everyone to ask questions through the Q&A function, but also on Twitter using the hashtag IECPS20. So we hope that everyone will be involved. Let me just say one word on CEPS and the Intereconomics cooperation. I think it's our cooperation has been working very well, and I think that the main reason is that we have one common point. We are both very interested in high topical issues, and we want to contribute to the debate. That's the way CEPS functions, and that's also the way Intereconomics chooses the topic of the issues and select the papers. So all those who would like to contribute to this debate are very much invited to follow CEPS and to submit their pieces to Intereconomics. Without further ado, since the program is very rich, I hand over again to Christian and then to Professor Skidelsky for the opening session. Many thanks, and I will meet virtually everyone again at 11:30 for the second session. Have a very fruitful discussion. Thanks.
So many thanks, Cynthia. Now it's my turn and my pleasure to introduce Robert Skidelsky, who gives a keynote on the economic response to COVID-19 in the European Union. For those of you who don't know Robert, he is a British economist and politician, as a researcher most famous for his monumental biography on Keynes and known to the scientific community as one of the most inspiring interpreters of Keynes and Keynesian economic thinking. He recently published an article in our sister journal in German language, Wirtschaftsdienst, where Keynes himself has published 100 years ago. His article is called Keynes, The Recent Return of the Master, with interesting historical observation on political cyclicality that Keynes always appears to celebrate a revival in times of crisis, as nowadays, when political advisors and policymakers, even in Germany, start to use Keynesian rhetoric, programs, and recipes to overcome the problems that this crisis has created. Robert Skidelsky might be right that we will all forget about Keynes and, as a consequence, impose huge austerity measures after the crisis, as we did after the last crisis, the financial crisis in 2008 in Southern Europe. On the other hand, today, on the onset of the second wave and double-dip recession, I guess there is quite high probability that this crisis will be with us for a longer period of time, and with the crisis, Keynesian ideas and policy recommendations will remain with us as well. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Skidelsky, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Christian, very much. I was delighted to accept the invitation of SEPS to give the keynote speech at its annual conference. And I hope, of course, that the health situation in Brussels quickly improves. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic offers a test of Schumpeter's theory of creative destruction. Schumpeter himself used the phrase to describe the process of technical innovation, but it can be applied more generally to social innovation. There's a strong cyclical element in it. Schumpeter understood that innovation doesn't progress in a linear fashion. Rather, it lurches from one extreme to another, each producing its own reaction. And the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly revealed its destructive power, which may well continue for some time to come. But now we have a chance to create something new, better, and in the jargon, more resilient and sustainable. The question is, will we take that chance? In political economy, the subject of my speech today, the excesses of Keynesian social democracy in the 1970s brought about the extreme reaction of neoliberalism. The hubris of neoliberalism, its failure to guard against the ever-present possibility of collapse, its inattention to social justice, its reckless embrace of globalization, the Faustian pact with consumerism, has in turn bred a reaction, but the direction of the reaction is still unclear. Populist forces of right and left, made up of fragments of old and new discontents, compete for the succession. The balance remains elusive. It's clear, I think, that we have both a short-term and a long-term crisis on our hands. In the short run, we run the risk of what some analysts are calling the Third Great World Depression. That may be exaggerated, but certainly we face a gloomy short-term prospect. In the long run, the risk is of the exhaustion of nature's tolerance for our profligate habits. The prize then is to enfold our pandemic recovery measures into a long-term strategy for a sustainable way of life. I won't say sustainable growth, for growth as we understand it may not be sustainable. The short-term threat to jobs and livelihoods is clear enough. Much of Europe is on a life support system. The world economy will have shrunk by about 5% in 2020, and hopes of a V-shaped recovery have been put on hold. This means that unemployment is set to go on rising through 2021. In the UK, we expect close to 10%. Everyone is waiting for the end of the virus so that we can get back to normal. But the virus is no longer the main problem, though it remains a substantial one. It is the scarring of the economy produced by a prolonged and continuing period of non-work, which, of course, endangers the recovery. And what about the further future? Suppose by heroic effort we succeed in reopening economies much as they were before. Can anyone say they were in a healthy or sustainable condition before the pandemic struck? Debt-driven growth, which produced consumption and asset booms followed by financial busts, that was the pre-pandemic normal. I'm often asked, what would British economist John Maynard Keynes have said? I'll try to give my answer, though I hasten to add that Keynes from beyond the grave has not authorized me to do so. Nor is Keynes the last word on the matters I will deal with, but he's the first word. My book, Keynes, The Return of the Master, was published in the autumn of 2009. It came out the year after the global banking collapse of 2008 and the massive rescue operations undertaken by governments all around the world. Not just the bailout of a bankrupt banking system, but also a large monetary and fiscal stimulus. This activism was in contrast to the do-nothing stance of governments following the Wall Street crash of 1929. And I believe that it prevented another Great Depression. The fall in output following the collapse of 2008 was limited to about a year, whereas output went on falling for 13 quarters after the collapse of 1929, a much deeper collapse than the more recent one. Long before the recovery was secure, however, our own stimulus was terminated. Alarmed by the deficits they'd incurred, governments started to slash public spending. The Return of the Master, the title of my book, proved brief. I guess everyone is a Keynesian in a foxhole, said Robert Lucas, high priest of Chicago economics. Keynes was for emergencies only. And we have the same reaction today. Compelled to close down a large fraction of their economies to stop the spread of the pandemic, governments have spent money freely to keep up incomes of millions of people. But they continue to hope that as the economy reopens, a V-shaped recovery will relieve them of their fiscal burden. The talk is of fiscal sustainability, the need for consolidation and debt reduction, even as the economy is set to shrink. Now, many would see this as reasonable. Most economists view the market system as fundamentally healthy. It will get sick from time to time, and therefore it will need medication, but it's basically self-healing, like the human body. So treatment should be limited in scope and duration. And this is particularly the case given the unreliability of political medicine. Keynes rejected this analogy between the market system and the self-healing body, and believed that a market system left unattended by the state could never be healthy. And this is why. Keynes's revolutionary insight was that capitalist market economies do not have an automatic tendency towards full employment. This assertion shocked the economists of Keynes's day, whose models taught them that persisting unemployment was impossible if wages were flexible. Keynes's Cambridge colleague, Arthur Pigou, expressed the typical belief of 1933. With perfectly free competition, he wrote, there would be a strong tendency for wage rates to be so related to demand that everyone is employed. Based on this argument, unemployed workers must be choosing not to work. Seeing the millions unemployed all around him during the Great Depression, Keynes thought There's something wrong with your model. These people aren't choosing not to work, they can't find work. So Keynesian economics starts with this blinding shaft of common sense. People are unemployed when there is no demand for their services. Yet this insight never fully converted the economics profession, who went on cooking up all kinds of fancy reasons to demonstrate that what looked like unwanted unemployment was really a choice for leisure. Today, I would bet that most economists believe deep down that most unemployed people could find work if they really wanted to, or if state benefits didn't provide them with an alternative income. But why don't economies quickly bounce back from collapses? Surely, if an employer doesn't want to employ me at €500 a week, I can always lower my wage requirement till it becomes profitable for them to hire me. By insisting on unrealistic wages, workers are pricing themselves out of jobs. But Keynes gave two reasons why even flexible wages will not maintain or restore employment. His first argument is rather paradoxical, and people have called it the fallacy of composition. If, and it is this, that every producer is also a consumer. My wages are your income because my wages buy your goods. If my wages go down, your income goes down too. The general principle is that cuts in production costs, whether by cutting wages or by laying off workers, deepen a slump by simultaneously cutting total demand or spending power in the economy. A fall of income in one part of the economy reduces production in another part, and so on in a downward spiral as unemployment spreads rapidly throughout the economy. Eventually, spending power is stabilized at a much lower level as people stop saving. But nothing has happened to stimulate consumption and therefore to promote a recovery. The strange idea that the way to revive an economy is by getting people to stop spending comes only to a well-trained neoclassical economist. Keynes's second argument against the V-shaped recovery model has to do with the behavior of money. It's characteristic of a slump that instead of investing their money, businesses hoard it or add to their cash balances. The greater this liquidity preference, as Keynes called it, is, the higher the rate of interest owners of money will charge for lending it out. But to stimulate production, borrowers need lower rates of interest, not higher rates of interest. So when confidence is low, the higher rates demanded by the banks for loans mean even less investment and less employment. In this way, flexibility of wages and stickiness of interest rates combine to deepen the slump. Contrary to Robert Lucas, without government stimulus, the economy will remain stuck in the foxhole. Of course, the mainstream economist has a comeback. Depressions or deep recessions are very rare events, like Nassim Taleb's black swans. So, they say, it's absurd to organize economic life as if the next slump is just round the corner. Market economies have built-in stability so powerful that slumps are rare events. This is exactly what Keynes denied. Black swans can fly out of a clear blue sky at any time, and we have just seen a large flock of them this year. Keynes pointed out that the theory of the self-correcting market economy depends on the idea that everyone, and particularly investors, can accurately predict the future. If they can accurately calculate what assets they buy today will be worth in 10 years' time, they would never buy things at the wrong prices. As Keynes wrote, sorry, the calculus of probability was supposed to be capable of reducing uncertainty to the same calculable status as certainty itself. But this was a myth. Actually, we have, as a rule, only the vaguest idea of any but the most direct consequences of our acts. This was the second huge shaft of common sense which Keynes injected into the economic argument. And a huge consequence followed. Because the future is uncertain, private investment will be unsteady. Prosperity will depend on people's animal spirits. When they're feeling confident, they hire more workers. When they're pessimistic, they lay them off. Two conclusions follow from this account of market behavior. The first is that collapses are always possible because the future is uncertain. And the second is that when they happen, there are no automatic market mechanisms to ensure a quick bounce back. And that's why governments are indispensable balancers of market economies. They add and subtract spending power as and when needed. This explains why there's no virtue in trying to balance the budget as such. Being Keynesian means having a theory of the economy that justifies the use of state budget to balance the economic activity at a decent level of output and employment. This can mean either a budget surplus or a budget deficit or a balanced budget, depending on what is happening in the economy. It's the accounts of the economy which need balancing, not its own accounts. Without this balancing act, the economy will have a spontaneous tendency not to full employment, but to persistent underemployment. So to maintain economic life on a balanced, even keel, governments need to do two things. First, they need to steady the rate of investment, and they can do this through public investment programs. Keynes wrote in 1936, "I expect the state, which is in a position to take long views, taking an ever greater responsibility for directly organizing investment." And this happened in the 25 years after the Second World War. But since the 1980s, the state's share in total investment has fallen drastically, and that's increased economic instability. Notice that a large state investment share is not just a policy for the foxhole, as Robert Lucas indicated, but a permanent part of economic management. Secondly, governments should pursue counter-cyclical policy to limit the effect of remaining fluctuations. This means injecting extra spending into the economy when private spending falls and reducing it when it rises. It can be done on the tax side or the spending side. The multiplier, based on what is called the marginal propensity to consume, tells governments what the multiplied effect of any spending they add to or subtract from the economy will be. So the answer to the failures of both old-fashioned Keynesianism and newfangled monetarism is not to abandon the balancing role of the state, but, in my view, to make it as automatic as possible. The state should commit to two things: a rolling program of public investment and a public sector job guarantee. The first would reduce fluctuations in investment to much narrower limits. The second would provide a buffer stock of jobs, which would automatically expand in a downturn and deplete in an upturn. Important to notice here that public investment doesn't require public ownership. That's the big myth of the neoliberals. Much of it could be done by quasi-state institutions like public investment banks or funds or state holding companies. These would operate under a broad central government mandate or mission, to use Mariano Mazzucato's word, that reflects national purpose, but which does not require operational control of the decisions of these institutions. In other words, they would be insulated from political interference. The counter-cyclical public sector job program would be centrally financed, but with projects chosen and administered locally. The result of both policies pursued together would be incredible. It would abolish unwanted unemployment for the first time since the Industrial Revolution. These two balancing functions, public investment and counter-cyclical policy, are needed to ensure the full employment and stability of capitalist market economies. And the fuller the use of a country's human resources, the more prosperous the country will be, the greater will be its social contentment, and the less the dangers of political extremism. This, in a nutshell, is the message of Keynes for our own day. Now, let me consider some objections to what I've just said. First of all, objections from the neoclassical side. First, as we've seen, neoclassical economists believe the market economy to be naturally stable. Hence, they view Keynesian demand management as inherently destabilizing. But history doesn't support them. The most stable period in modern times throughout the world, especially in Europe and the United States, that is a period with the fullest employment and fastest growth rate, was the period from 1950 to 1975, when Keynesian theory and policy were in control. Second, anti-Keynesian economists teach that public investment crowds out private investment. This is true if a government adds to public spending when all the economy's resources are already fully employed. It's first cousin of the idea that public borrowing merely adds to the burdens of future generations. But whenever there's spare capacity, public investment can crowd in private investment by increasing the total demand for goods and services. Most governments drastically cut public investment after the 1970s. What was the result? Growth was halved and unemployment rose. Well, of course, some public investment is bound to be wasted. But when people talk about the waste of public spending, they rarely compare it to the waste of unemployment. Third, monetarist economists, descendants of Milton Friedman, claim that Keynes's counter-cyclical policy is inherently inflationary. Vote catching, they say, will lead Keynesian politicians to print too much money, resulting in creeping and eventually accelerating inflation. Now, this is an interesting argument because behind the monetarist case is the belief that the only shock against which policy has to guard is governments monkeying around with money. Instability in the price level can delude people into trading at false prices, thereby disturbing the natural equilibrium of market transactions. If the key to economic stability is a low and constant rate of inflation, then control of the money supply, or equivalently of interest rates, needs to be taken out of the hands of politicians and vested in independent central banks. But again, history gives only qualified support to the monetarist thesis. Inflation was subdued throughout the 25 years of the Keynesian era and only started to rise at the end of the 1960s for reasons much more connected with the Vietnam War than with Keynesian economics. And as for the inherent stability of an economy with stable money, well, a decade of low inflation didn't prevent the financial collapse of 2008 and to 2009. Nor did quantitative easing, flooding the economy with central bank base money in 2009 to 2012, bring about a robust recovery after the collapse. The aim of QE is to lower the cost of borrowing by forcing up the price of bonds. Its fallacy lies in the belief that the money supply, which includes broad money or bank credit, is directly under the control of the central bank. How much bank credit and expansion of base money brings about depends on Keynes's animal spirits. A very high rate of interest can sometimes kill off a boom, but even a negative rate of interest might not produce recovery if expectations of profit from increased investment are zero. Neoclassical economists are not the only critics of Keynesianism. Marxists would claim that such an updated Keynesian program is just a fantasy. A capitalist economy needs a reserve army of the unemployed to keep up profits by keeping down wages. They say that only a fully socialized economy can abolish unemployment and maintain wage growth. But again, the answer is not in their favor. Between 1950 and 1975, Keynesian managed capitalist economies average unemployment rates of 2 to 3%, half of what they've been since. They had double the growth rates we have had since, and wages were rising rather than stagnating. And the cost of inflation was only slightly higher than we've experienced under recent management. No system of political economy is perfect, I accept that. But it should be judged not by comparison with some ideal system, which is only present in economic textbooks, but with realistic alternatives. Keynes set out to save democracy from the two challenges of his day, fascism and communism. He said that if we continued with laissez-faire in the face of massive unemployment, political freedom wouldn't survive. But, and I'm quoting him, it may be possible by a right analysis of the problem to cure the disease while preserving efficiency and freedom. I would echo him today. I doubt if Western populations will for much longer tolerate a political economy that delivers persisting underemployment, frequent crashes, stagnant wages, and extreme inequalities of wealth and income. In thinking about our post-COVID world, Keynes has made an excellent start, but he didn't solve all the problems we face today. Although he assumed that the desire to consume more and more would eventually be satiated by abundance, he had no inkling of long-term ecological constraints on growth. He understood that inequality was both an economic and an ethical problem, but his theoretical work was directed to overcoming unemployment, the big problem of the day, and he didn't link it to the unequal distribution of wealth, which today we're much more likely to do. Let me conclude by putting what I've just said into a European context. I know that's going to be more fully explored later on in the day, but I do raise it now because it's a serious question. While the rules of the European Union prevent member states from pursuing Keynesian policies at the national level, there's no provision for European-wide Keynesianism. The fundamental design flaw of the European Union, and especially the Eurozone, has often been pointed out. It created a monetary union without three crucial tools which are needed to stabilize economies: a budget big enough to act as a balancer, a fiscal transfer capacity to deal with asymmetric shocks, and a lender of last resort for the banking system. These were not accidental omissions. The European monetary system was built on the belief that they were unnecessary. The creators of the Union accepted the Friedmanite monetary doctrine that rule-governed market economies are naturally stable, which was, of course, consistent with the long-standing anti-inflationary views of the German Bundesbank. But it was worse than that. The Eurozone Treaty forbade the use of stabilizing tools at the national level as well. What this meant is that the Union as a whole was badly equipped to deal with the kinds of shocks to which market capitalism is always prone. The conventional or German view, I call it German view of the financial crisis of 2008-2009, was that it resulted from the excessive public debts and fiscal profligacy of the Mediterranean countries. Had these countries balanced their budgets as the rules prescribed, the financial shock would have been much less, or possibly entirely avoidable. The alternative, and I think correct view, is that the Union provided no non-deflationary mechanism for adjusting current account balances between its members. Keynes's remark of 1941 applies very accurately to the EU system. The process of adjustment is compulsory for the debtor and voluntary for the creditor. The debtor must borrow. The creditor is under no such compulsion. His clearing union set out to remedy this design flaw in the global system of the day by providing for creditor adjustment. It mandated creditor adjustment as well as debtor adjustment, but no such mechanism was established in Europe. As a result, Germany in particular was left free to pile up current account surpluses without limit. The system was maintained by an unstable system of creditor loans, which dried up the moment debtors got into trouble. With the fiscal policy of all member states constrained by balanced budget rules and public debt ceilings, monetary policy, the weaker of the stabilization instruments, was the only macroeconomic policy available. Mario Draghi, the president of the ECB, found a way of bending the rules of the European Central Bank sufficiently to rescue the European Union from collapse in 2015. But he recognized the limits of a purely monetary stimulus. In an interview with the Financial Times a year ago, this is what he said: "I've talked about fiscal policy as a necessary complement to monetary policy since 2014. Now the need is more urgent than before. Monetary policy will continue to do its job, but the negative side effects as you move forward are more and more visible. Monetary pumping worked, but more feebly than fiscal pumping would have." And naturally and logically, Draghi proposed a budget for the Eurozone large enough to be a stabilizing tool, but this has not been done. COVID-19 has brought one promising institutional innovation. In July of this year, the European Commission proposed a 750 billion European Recovery Fund, dubbed Next Generation EU. This would authorize the Commission to borrow in the capital markets on the EU's behalf and disburse the loans raised as grants, and disburse grants and loans split half and half to its members. However, it has two obvious limitations. The European Council called the fund an exceptional response to temporary but extreme circumstances, and I quote that. In other words, it's not intended to become a permanent part of the EU's institutional structure, so it is limited in size, scope, and duration. It's limited, in other words, to Robert Lucas's foxhole. That's the theoretical flaw. The practical flaw is it still has to be agreed by all 27 members. As a result of continuous wrangling, no budgetary allocations have yet been made. What seemed like an imaginative leap forward looks like a quagmire. As one analyst has remarked, a sword of Damocles therefore hangs over the whole plan. And many members are still betting on that V-shaped recovery. Germany and France are planning to cut their budget deficits next year, with the peak of the stimulus seemingly past. The calls for consolidation are like those leading to the self-induced double dip recession of 2011. I need only say a few words in my conclusion. With the world on the brink of yet another steep recession, and with ecological disaster looming in the further future, we can't any longer afford the luxury of an economic policy which concentrates on the fight against inflation, leads unemployment to emergency measures, leaves distribution of wealth and income to the market, and ignores ecological challenges. Overcoming the scourge of unemployment, connecting its treatment to issues of just distribution nationally and globally, and linking both to a Green New Deal. This tripartite task is the biggest politico-economic challenge we face. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for this inspiring talk and the outlook and the discussion of the different policy alternatives, particularly from a Keynesian perspective. I did not get a lot of questions from the Q&A, so let me ask you a few follow-up questions. You were talking about the design flaws. If the European Union, the monetary union, has no stabilizing tool available. And on the other hand, you said we have a Schumpeterian moment so that we could redesign institutions maybe today. So what do you think? How should we redesign the European institutions?
Well, you know, there are a number of things that you could do. I mean, one of the things is you could have a European International Monetary Fund, a European Monetary Fund, based not on the Bretton Woods design exactly, but on the Keynes's own plan in 1941, which would provide for creditor adjustment as well as debtor adjustment. In other words, he thought creditors should be fined, penalized for running permanent current account surpluses. In fact, after a point, those surpluses would be confiscated and redistributed among the debtors. The debtors would be under some constraints as well. I mean, it was meant to be a symmetrical adjustment process. Of course, you can see why the Americans didn't approve of that plan. They wanted to keep control over their own surpluses and lend them out if they needed to, to their political allies and friends. So they wanted to keep discretion. And Germany, similarly, you can imagine, will not want to surrender its surpluses to a fund or a bank which has discretion to, which has to redistribute them. So you can see that runs into a big obstacle. I mean, that's one thing that could be done. In fact, President Macron vaguely proposed something like this a year or so ago, but it, of course, hasn't been acted on. A second thing is to just make a much larger budget. I mean, at the moment, it's, I think, 1% of total members' GDPs. You could raise that to 2%, and that would give you a bit more of a firepower, fiscal firepower, to deal with these shocks, symmetric shocks, because they eventually they hit everyone. A third thing you could do is to provide for a much more transparent and clear fiscal distribution, fiscal redistribution system, transfer system, where symmetrical shocks occur, and we haven't got that at the moment. So these are things that can be done, and I'm thinking of other things. I mean, you know, the idea of a Eurobond, which could be issued by all governments. Now, all that has been discussed, but very little has been done. There have been initiatives, and we don't know whether they'll fizzle out or whether they'll lead to anything. The big problem, as people say, is the political will to do these things, but that's just a phrase. I mean, behind the lack of political will is the reluctance to actually go forward to create a European government armed with the powers of a government. And one reason for that is, who would it be accountable to? You see, there's a democratic deficit. So the deficit, something has to be done about the deficit, not the budget deficit, but the political deficit, before you can move forward to creating a European government. I think that's a huge hurdle, an immense hurdle. And so then there are two prospects for the European Union. Either it breaks up in some way, maybe starting with some breakup of the monetary union, or it muddles along in an ad hoc way. I think probably the second is likeliest. They'll find ways to break the rules whenever they have to, without saying they're doing it, in order to keep the show afloat. I think that's what will probably more likely to happen, at any rate, in the short and medium term.
Yeah, that sounds quite realistic. On the other hand, from a politician point of view, I mean, you are a politician. You know that all the things you mentioned, you suggested, are problematic, particularly for the frugal four, the governments we call the frugal four, the Germans, who are having the surpluses you would like to charge. So how would you, or how do you think a political strategy could look like to create these kind of institutions and to convince the frugal four and the Germans?
Well, a key actor is France. I mean, the European Union is basically, or has been, a Franco-German club. And that was basically the conclusion of the de Gaulle Adenauer Pact of the 1960s. De Gaulle was prepared to leave the European Union, but he said, okay, if we work together, we can make it work. He was very anti-federalist. So it's depended on that. That relationship. France has to bring pressure on Germany. Germany doesn't want the European Union to break up, and it certainly doesn't want the Eurozone to break up, because it gets a lot of benefit from the existence of the Eurozone in the form of a lower exchange rate for its exports to outside Europe, which are half of its exports. So Germany wants to keep this together. France can bring pressure on Germany and say, look, you've got to have a more symmetrical system. And France could lead a group here, I think, of Mediterranean countries, particularly Italy, with Italy. So you'd get a sort of northern bloc, which is more conservative. and a southern bloc which is more radical. And out of that negotiation between those two, something might emerge. But France and Italy and other Mediterranean, Greece maybe, have and Spain have got to get together and say, look, you want us to be part of this. This is what we want done. But they've got to have a clear strategy themselves. And that strategy has to be informed by an economic theory, if you like, that they need this kind of symmetry, that the European Union is not automatically self-adjusting, needing only emergency measures. They have to have a theoretical basis for the political strategy. And I'm not sure it exists. I'm not sure it exists, you see. I think, again, they're all in the area of emergency measures. Perhaps more of it exists, this longer term thinking, in relation to ecological challenges. There, I think, and that could be a way in for something more substantial in the way of economic cooperation. But I think this would be my answer to your question.
Yes. I mean, I don't know whether these economic ideas behind all these political views and forces exist as well. Probably we are muddling through. But given that we have this divide in Europe, probably because between the north versus the south, and now the upcoming populism as new political forces, right-wing populism, but also left-wing populism. And you mentioned that Keynes himself these days, 80 years ago, were fighting against political extremism. Would you see that the crisis we have now could create even more political extremism, Euroscepticism, nationalism, and all these kind of stuff that will divide Europe even more?
Yes, if we have a really serious, severe recession, like a depression, and millions of Europeans remain out of work, if the economy shrinks, and if no effective countermeasures are taken, then I would expect populism to gain enormously. There's already, I mean, obviously I haven't mentioned Britain's leaving the European Union, but that was a populist uprising against the European Union. It wasn't a fascist uprising, but it was a nationalist uprising. And it's possible that there will be other countries in which nationalist forces become so strong that they will vote to leave. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's very possible. It depends on the response, but the response, as I say, depends on the theory. I mean, I believe in economic theory does drive economic policy. I know, Keynes always said so, and I think that's right. I don't think it's just vested interests. You can say, well, look, the European Union was simply constructed as a rich person's club. There was no theory behind it. They just wanted to have as much freedom to maximize their profits as they wanted. But no, behind that is something else, which is that that this is the way, this is the healthy way. If you realize that freedom given to the business to maximize its profits actually creates a much sicker economy, and in the end puts the business community in jeopardy from nationalism as well, then I think you may begin to put the dots together and see the connection between extreme inequality and malfunction, macroeconomic malfunction.
Yeah. From theory, I would like to go more into the measures that we would suggest now, or you would suggest now, in the context of this specific crisis. Do you think that this crisis, the coronavirus crisis, with its problems with social distancing and lockdowns and so on, is specific? Can we apply typical standard Keynesian therapy to this crisis, given that governments do lockdowns and try to reduce contacts? Are there Keynesian measures, like, I don't know, investment programs that will reduce contacts? Are there more smart Keynesian measures today?
Yeah. Well, I think, I think you have to distinguish between those occupations in which social distancing is essential, and those which are more outdoor occupations, let's say in construction. I mean, they could get, even with present lockdown measures, they could go ahead in our country and equivalently in Europe with big infrastructure projects. They could also go ahead with local outdoor projects. I mean, I know you can go beyond tree planting, but making housing more energy efficient, building houses, social houses. I mean, there are lots of things that don't involve social. If they involve social distance, the incentive is for people to work isolated from each other, like in offices, for example. Offices get dispersed into people's homes. I think that raises even a separate issue, which is what happens to the idea of the workplace if people no longer meet. I mean, that's a change in the method of working. I'm not sure what its macroeconomic effects are. My assumption is that, of course, if people work more and more from their homes, this is, in one sense, business will like this because it means you don't have to spend money on building office blocks. So you can cut costs. Home working is a cutting cost strategy. One must never forget that. It means you don't have to spend money on building.
So it reduces demand.
Yeah, and so it reduces demand.
So one more question, and also from the Q&A I got regarding the distribution instruments, and maybe this is linked to the effects of the coronavirus crisis. As we have seen, there are distributive effects, like more wealthy people can reduce consumption more, while the lower class loses their jobs. So is there an opportunity to redistribute? Is there a case for wealth distribution or for, let's say, basic income guarantee, for example?
Well, I think distribution is a key point. One of the bad things about quantitative easing was it did redistribute, but upwards and not downwards. Because I mean, the people who acquired the cash they were asset owners to start with. So its aim was to increase the value of already existing assets, and that of course benefited the wealthy. You could do it in a way that benefited the poor. But again, not in the conventional way of quantitative easing. You would then have to have basically a fiscal operation in which, and in America, they started doing this. They started sending checks to poor people, and that would be a redistributionary mechanism. But your basic question: can you now have a wealth tax, possibly to finance a basic income guarantee? I don't think this is good for the short term. It's something one could be thinking about. The one thing you don't want when you want to get a quick recovery is to slap a lot of heavy taxes on people. In other words, you have to do these things in sequence. Recovery before reform. Once you get the recovery going, then you can start the big reform things, but not to tomorrow. That would be my answer.
Okay. Taxing low propensity to consume and redistributing to the people with high propensity to consume would be that an idea for the crisis?
That would be an idea. Yes, I mean there are different ways of doing this. I mean, if you want to use a tax cutting route, which I'm not saying shouldn't be used, then you place the highest, you give the highest tax reliefs to those with the lowest incomes.
Yeah.
And you can do that in many ways.
Yeah, so that would be redistributive issues and possibilities. So, but I think that at 11 o'clock we reached our time budget. So thank you very much, Robert. Thank you very much, everybody, for having us here. We will keep on with a session on the economic response to COVID-19 at 11:30 in half an hour, and we'll do a little break.
I stunned everyone.